Go live.
You're live. Okay, we are back and we are now going to talk about existing statute for state aid for school construction. Legislative Council, thank you.
Thank you, Beth St. James, Office of Legislative Counsel. I am going to fly through this. This will hopefully be kind of a crutch for you as we continue conversations to go back and rely on for current law. Basically, I've just pulled right from the statutes. Before I go into that, I just want to answer Rep. Emmons' question, if you will indulge me, about the joint contracts between districts. Those two statutes that we talked about before the break have been around since 1949.
Oh, really? Okay.
The first statute, which is just enabling school districts to do that, does not appear to have ever been amended.
That's the first one.
The second section 572, which goes into a little bit more detail about what the joint board has the ability to do, and then how members are allocated to the joint board from the various districts involved. Also, 1949. It looks like it has really not been amended at all, other than tech corrections bills. There was a piece added about the allocation of the school board members to the board. That was added, I think, in 1961. And then in 1991, with the change in the definition of public school, some of those terms were updated, but otherwise all amendments have taken place in the tech corrections bill. So I don't know how well it would work today.
Or even it worked back then.
Okay, state aid for capital construction costs. You do have a current law on the books that has not been repealed. The only thing when we talk about the pause to the school construction program is there's just been a pause in the state giving funding. But the laws have not been repealed. So what this presentation is going to do is basically give you a primer for what is currently on the books. And then my understanding is Bob is going to talk about what actually used to happen. Okay. So hot link right here, 16 VSA chapter 123 is the current program. If you click on this, it's going to bring you to all of the statutes. Okay. I am just going to breeze through this and very basically describe it. So the first thing that has to happen, or the first thing I will say, is current law does allow for independent schools to take part in this program. So when I'm talking about schools going forward, just know that independent schools are included. First step is a preliminary application, and that goes to the Secretary of Education. The preliminary application is required to include information that is required by state board rule that Bob is going to talk about, and then specify the need for the purpose of the project. And the secretary is required to consider the following things when looking at a preliminary application. Approving that preliminary application. So regional educational opportunities and needs, including school building capacities across school district boundaries, and available infrastructure in neighboring communities, economic efficiencies, the suitability of an existing school building to meet educational needs, and statewide education initiatives in the strategic plan of the State Board of Education. Okay, so step one, preliminary application. State board rules are going to require certain things, and it goes to the Secretary of Education, and the Secretary of Education is looking for certain things when it's looking to approve the preliminary application.
If I could ask, what's your, going back, economic efficiencies with looking for driving that or work driving?
I don't, I don't know the legislative intent behind that. We can certainly look more into that.
Just curious.
The secretary may approve a preliminary application if the need addressed by the project cannot reasonably be met by other means. Project or part of the project fulfills a need occasioned by health and safety issues, inadequate facilities when the program that they're serving is required by state or federal law, excessive energy use or deterioration of an existing building, and the proposed type, kind, quality, size, and estimated cost of the project are suitable for the proposed curriculum and meet legal standards, right? If you're going to spend $1 million on chemistry labs for but it's an elementary school, maybe that's not really appropriate.
I see the excessive energy part here. My understanding, we're probably going to get more of this, is that at some point in the program, biomass energy conversion became a huge priority. Lots of projects, lots of money.
90%.
Yeah.
We picked. So that cost, that's what tanked us.
Priority, so you've got step one, submit a preliminary application to the Secretary of Education. But if you get 10 preliminary applications, how do you allocate funding? So following approval of a preliminary application, and provided that the district has voted funds or authorized a bond for the total estimated cost of the project, right? So two things here. Preliminary approval by the secretary of your preliminary application, and the district has to have approved the funds, whether that's through a bond, or maybe they have a capital reserve and the project is able to be funded by money they already have on the books. Then the state board is going to assign points to that project so it can be placed on a priority list. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip over details of priority here. Just know that it's a state board function. And there is a priority list. So under current law, no state aid is available under Title 16. So that's not saying that the state can't grant funding in some other program, but under this program, no state funding would be available for any proposed project or construction if the secretary finds that the need for the project or construction has arisen in whole or in part from significant deferred maintenance. And what does deferred maintenance mean? It's defined by state board rule. Okay. Request for legislative appropriation. This is, I think, in my world, in Title 16, this is unique. This is really the only place in Title 16 I see a specific committee mentioned here, right? So when we were talking about jurisdiction last time, Title 16, the law specifically says that the state board presents to the institutions committees with their capital funding request every year. And then following the receipt of that request, the committees on institutions can then recommend to vote on by the General Assembly what the total amount of money they're giving to school construction under this Title 16 program is. But the General Assembly cannot revise the order of project priorities.
We did.
Again, this is current law. You can always not withstand it, right?
Yeah.
So the State Board of Education assigns priorities.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. And then the law also spells out exactly what the funding requests to the committees need to include. Again, in the interest of time, I'm going to skip over specifics.
And given the legislation that passed a couple months ago about State Board of Education versus AOE, that doesn't change this priority scheme, like who sets the priority scheme, correct?
This does not, and I actually don't know what bill or act you're talking about.
You're talking about the quality standards, right?
So
Yeah, what we just
Oh.
went through.
a couple months ago.
Yeah, isn't it what we just went through? The district quality standards?
District quality standards are a rule series that AOE was tasked with developing out of Act 127 from 2022. I will just say this law has not changed.
There is discussion.
There was a lot of
A lot
discussion,
of chatter in the building about state board, AOE,
but I don't think anything.
what authority should rest where, secretary, commissioner, that's one of the charges of the commission. You know, I think that's definitely part of the background of our work.
Okay, thank you.
It's not directly our charge, but it's
Spinning out.
it's spinning.
So we've gone through a preliminary application, we've gone through priority setting. The state board has gone to the legislature, to the institution committee specifically, and said, here's our list of priorities, here's how much money we need to do it. And the legislature has appropriated funds. And now we gotta use that money. So a school district shall not begin construction before the state board gives approval to a final application. So two applications, preliminary application, then a final application. There is an unless, right? So the secretary can approve for good cause the construction to start before that final approval. A school district can submit their final application at any time following approval of a preliminary application. And then the board approves the final application for a project, provided that, and then there's a whole host of things that need to be met. They had to have been preliminarily, right? That makes sense. There needs to have been a bond voted on, or authorized funds, project management, et cetera. A district may begin construction upon receipt of a final approval. However, under current law, a district will not be reimbursed for debt incurred due to borrowing of funds in anticipation of aid. Okay. This, I think, is what everyone is most interested in. So this is, again, general. For the majority of projects, the state is going to kick in 30% of the approved project costs.
So can I qualify that?
Mhm.
It is 30% of eligible cost
We get there.
of that. I just want people
Yep.
thinking it's 30% of the full project.
For renewable energy projects, 75% of the approved. So again, remember, we're looking at approved project costs, right? All of that has to be eligible, but that's an excellent point. For consolidation projects, which means that the construction projects involves some sort of school governance consolidation, or maybe even schools within a school district consolidating. 50%, so a little bit more than if it was not involving some sort of consolidation.
And governance counts? Governance or
So,
school consolidation?
so if it was two school districts merging, that would be considered a consolidation cost. But I also believe if it was, you had 3 elementary schools and you were going down to 1, that would
It's the
also be.
buildings. It's the
yeah.
buildings.
Targeted for the buildings.
Yeah, it's the buildings. We are encouraging consolidation, but the way the dollars from the state is specifically for buildings. So it would be consolidating at 3 to 2 buildings or 1 building or whatever.
So as Rep. Evans mentioned, it's not just 30% of the bottom line of any project. There are, it's eligible costs. So there are space and cost parameters that are set by state board rule. And then there's some costs for land tests might be eligible, but only those portions of a project shall be eligible for construction aid which meet space and cost parameters adopted by state board rule. And then the state board rule goes into all of those details. That is not in statute, it's in rule. And I keep hammering the difference between statute and rule because your job is statute. And you are tasked with looking at a lot of things. Some of those things live in these statutes currently, and some of those things live in state board rule. And so you all will need to decide if you want to continue to delegate rulemaking authority for some of your charge, or whether you want to pull that into statute, or vice versa, whether you want to kick some of what's in statute to rule, et cetera. So that's why I keep hammering on that. Payment. Once an approved project is under construction or has been construction, and upon appropriation of funds sufficient, the state board shall certify an award for the project to the Commissioner of Finance, who issues half of the payment or the entire award if the project's complete. And then after a project's complete, after a project has been completed according to approved plans and specifications, right? So it's not just that it's complete, it's that it's finished according to what everyone agreed was going to be done. The cost has been audited by the Agency of Education. Then the secretary certifies the remainder of the award. I find that confusing, that the state board is doing one and the secretary is doing another, but the state board could do both. Just pointing at that.
So basically, when you put a shovel in the ground, you get the first half of your 30%. At the end, when everything's been signed off, you get the final half, and that could be 3 years later. Or 2 years later. So you're not getting the full amount when you start construction.
So other provisions, so basically what we just walked through was basically one entire statute, section 348. 348 is you're gonna be dreaming about that number. There are other statutes in this chapter, and I just have listed these out here. So there's a law that addresses appeals. So if any school district who's put forward an application is upset about what they're getting or the approval process, there is an appeal process here. There's a law on repayment obligations upon sale of school building. There's a whole section on energy performance contracting. There's a whole section on construction of CTE centers. Basically, that's 50% of the approved cost of the project. Approved is going to trigger eligibility. There's a whole statute on the allocation of costs associated with wiring installation for school buildings that may be designated as an emergency operations center. There's a whole section on the form of the site building plans to be submitted to the secretary. And then there is a whole section on debt incurred due to school construction projects and a district's debt limit. That's separate. Debt limit, just to take the elephant out of the room, is separate than excess spending. Those are two separate things. I am going to just leave this here. There are 2 slides with all of the laws since 2007 that have touched on school construction and the moratorium. I've done my best. They're all hot linked here. I've done my best to summarize what they've each done, but starting in 2007, suspended state aid for school construction. 2008, requiring, continuing the suspension, but asking the secretary to continue to review preliminary applications upon the district's request solely for the purposes of calculating excess spending. And then there's been various different things that have happened over the years as far as requiring reports and studies and recommendations, all concluding with your enabling legislation in 2024 Act 149, creating you all. So again, these are all hot linked. Click on them as you see fit. I'm happy to answer any questions, but this is the history of how we got here. And I did my best to link to reports when I could find one. Not everything that's been commissioned I have easily been able to find. That doesn't mean that it doesn't exist, but it just may not be easy to, it may not be on the legislature's website. And that's it.
Thank you. Thank
Thanks a
you.
lot. Thank you.
Yeah.
We're gonna jump into now the practicality of how the program actually worked and some institutional knowledge at AOE that will help us construct some of this. So thank you so much to Bob, and you'll introduce the rest of the witnesses as needed. And we'll do our best in about 35 minutes so that then we can break for lunch.
Okay, so for the record, I'm Bob Downey with the Agency of Education, and with me, our oracle of all things construction is Cassandra Ryan. So all I can do is present to you what I have digested from reading and trying to understand myself for the first time, what school construction in Vermont used to look like, but any kind of context that is beyond that depth of what I've been able to do, Cassandra will I'm sure, be able to provide every answer that you would need. Great. Yeah. So you all have the presentations.
Thank you, Megan, for having us so well prepared.
All right, so we're here to talk through school construction, and basically my overview is going to review what the old school construction program was in a high level kind of discussion, and then just familiarize you all with these state board rules that are associated with the construction. They're too numerous to go through in detail, and but I just wanted to give you a listing of them because I think when we get done looking at the SPE rules, you're going to see that this program had so many important elements of it that made the program sound. It wasn't like the program was deficient. Its lack of funding is always the issue, right? Mm-hmm. So when we compare ourselves to other states around us, I just wanted to keep in mind there is a program that was in place that should have been funded. That we were just comparable, and other states might be looking at us as though we were somebody to envy. So, all right. So taking a look at what it used to be a full construction program that used to take care of small type projects, larger type projects, and then emergency projects. The current program, as it stands right now, only currently takes care of emergency construction. The other two planned construction, as you know, has been suspended as Beth went through. But at the time, it used to be comprised of two program managers, a program manager and an assistant manager. The key partners were all the sister agencies within the state that always looked at any kind of project from their lens of what was their role in approving it. So whether it was a historic preservation property, whether it was anything to do with Act 250, public safety, transportation, everything that has to do with any of the sister agencies' purview, they would be looking at it from that perspective.
Can I just clarify, the team comprised of two members, program manager and assistant manager. They were housed in AOE?
I believe so, yes. Yeah,
Yes,
yeah,
yeah, two full FTE housed at AOE in the finance department.
So they had oversight of all the projected projects and could work with the local school districts and within the agency of ed as well. So it was focused in the agency of ed
Mhm.
for those two folks,
right.
which we no longer have.
Right.
Or do we?
Those positions were absorbed at the agency differently. They were not funded after the suspension and they were absorbed in different expertise.
Right, so right now we have no construction oversight at all. And I don't want to deviate from the order of the slide, but the only connection that we have currently to this, we still do the pre-approval. But before this year's yield bill and what happened with excess spending, now we don't really have a link even into that pre-approval. In other words, since we're not really approving valid construction costs, which could be exempted from the education spending calculation, now it's like, what are we doing? But we're encouraging everybody to continue going with the pre-approval because if excess spending exemptions are reinstated, it is good to have had the cost validated for their project. And we'll get into that a little later on as we talk about other issues that you were mentioning of the eligible costs and that maximum cost for state participation and how that ties into the excess spending as well. So, all right, the dollar values that are distributed, shown here, came from the Vermont Bond Bank when we were actually back months ago into the construction task force. So these numbers were courtesy of the Vermont Bond Bank. But 2000 and 2008, they were saying that there was nominally $91 million, $91.5 million in construction. And then the LEAs nominally bonded roughly $192 million in that same 8-year period.
So it's state aid in one line and the
Right.
local LEA.
Yeah.
91.6 is state aid.
Yeah.
But that's up to the point of the moratorium.
That's right.
Up to that point, when we put in the moratorium, we had a $70 million deficit. We had $70 million in obligation to our districts at that point.
Oh, and then the continued pay down of those bonds.
Right, that's why we went
Until
into a more,
2016 or-
right, that's why we went into a moratorium because we couldn't meet those obligations in
Mhm.
a timely manner. Because we're only funding 7 to 10 million a year.
Right.
And that, so we, on top of that 91.6 in 2008, we also had another 70 million that was out there
Yeah.
that we owed.
All right, and so as we kind of alluded to a little bit earlier, emergency construction aid is the only active aid that's there. And it's a low amount in terms of today's dollars. It's 30% of a maximum project cost of 100,000. So it's capped at 100,000. Even if the emergency is over that 100,000 ceiling, it's being capped at 30%. But 30% in these days is not very much. $30,000 isn't a lot for any emergency that really happens. And it's purely a reimbursement program. So there's no upfront monies available when it's most needed, right? So the school district have to absorb the cost, go through the process of the emergency application, and it has to meet certain criteria. And among those is it an unanticipated event that happens? And there are continuing issues in schools that can be construed to be emergency because their impact is an emergency, but it's not an emergency condition as though there's imminent threat to life and safety and health, right? So it's sometimes hard to say no to a glaring issue that is truly causing an emergency for a school, but it doesn't quite meet that threshold of an imminent threat to health and safety. So going forward with the construction working group, considerations about elevating that $30,000 or the ceiling above, the ceiling that we currently cap it at. Can we talk about maybe increasing that to something that's more realistic for today's type of cost?
So if I can kind of connect the dots in terms of one thought that's been put on the table about having a facilities management person.
Mhm.
What we looked at, we wanted that way back in the early 2000s to have something similar to that, number one. Number two, because we had that program manager within AOE that was constantly working with our local school districts, they could say to a local school district, you know, your lifespan of your boiler is coming up here. You've got 2 years left to it. You got a year left. You really have to start figuring this out in your capital projects. Because if it goes, it may not be considered an emergency because you've been warned. The same with roofs, the same with just their capital infrastructure. And because we had that connection with the program manager in AOE working directly with our school boards, districts, when an emergency situation occurred, sometimes they were denied by AOE because we've been mentioning this to you for 2 years and you've done nothing. So therefore, you're not going to be eligible for the emergency aid. Or this came out of the blue. We didn't know any of this was going to happen. You could be eligible. So by losing the program manager and losing that connection with our local school districts, we're still appropriating $50,000 per year in the capital budget for emergency projects, but there's nobody there as a check and balance to make sure it's really an emergency.
Yeah, come on up, please, yeah.
Join the party.
Right up here. So you don't have to, I just didn't want to talk to you about that.
You can just introduce yourself
That's
for the
it.
record. Thank you.
Sandra Ryan, Director of Regulatory Compliance, Agency of Education. So you're right, Representative Adams, that we lost a lot with the suspension. It wasn't simply about the suspension of the funding. It's a suspension of the agency having this very valuable information and contacts with our schools. So there was, during that suspension, there was no body at the agency to receive information, push out information, be involved. And so we've lost a lot of data over those years as well. But yes, absolutely. During that time, I would say that was there was always a forward look. We read the newspaper headlines. We were looking at school board meeting minutes to make sure that we were following. If a board was having trouble getting a roof replacement that was really inching up on its useful life and was having trouble getting that passed, I just felt like we were very much in the know at that point of our buildings.
And we could go down so many rabbit holes here. and get very exciting to
Yes,
talk about.
sorry.
No,
I'm a
no,
talker.
Sorry, I'm gonna actually elaborate on that.
Okay.
Because by doing the facilities assessment that we recently went through,
Mhm.
right, we now have a database of all the assets in the schools. And those assets were viewed upon a criteria called remaining useful life. So we now have within our database, the calendar is constantly tracking down to when that remaining useful life is 0. And when it does, that's now going to be part of a 5-year capital plan that we can spit out of the database for all schools to have, right? And now we actually have, even though we don't have active eyes on it, the database having been set up, it's actually taking care of keeping track of what assets are reaching the end of their useful life. And now this gives every school district that wants to use that database the power to say, okay, we can now start to forecast ahead of time, 2 years before our boiler times out, let's be doing a capital plan. The facilities managers and the qualifications of the person to be able to understand that, assess that, understand what systems have the greatest priorities in the building in terms of its being occupiable. Those are all key things. So it all integrates into our whole hopes of doing qualified facility manager training with certification, right? We have the 5-year capital plan that'll come out of this database. And then the operations and maintenance manual that Courtney was referencing there, at least it gives a common thread of materials and systems that people should be considerate of if they want to take and be good stewards of the assets entrusted to them. So it's really kind of exciting because even though we've lost those eyes, we now have data that's just in the background with the computing technology. It's keeping track of that. And I think that's going to be really key moving forward. So it's a really wonderful point Cassandra brings up, because if we don't have eyes on it somehow, things fall through the crack. And then as Beth mentioned in the statute, deferred maintenance is not something that we just go out and dole money to deal with, right? So even the facility manager that does a wonderful job building a capital improvement, if the board rejects the budget, they've done their job identifying what needs to be money spent on. Somehow the district has to find out how to approve the budget so that we don't build a deferred backlog of work, which then leads to the very condition we're suffering from. So
It's also a really great tool for citizens, right? Like our citizens to be able to look and compare the status of their building, to be able to anticipate, and also verification of trust that the issue that they're being asked to approve is actually an issue, and how do they compare to neighboring
absolutely. Yeah.
districts and buildings.
Yeah. So it's really good. It's a little divergent down from the path
Yes.
that we're talking here, but nevertheless, it's really important because it ties into everything that we will be talking about as we go through the summer. Okay, so then the suspended programs are the ones that are really the main meat of the matter of why we're here, right? There were two types of programs, we're calling it type 2 infrastructure. And these are the ones that extend the useful life of the building, but aren't adding square footage. And so these are the big ones, like we were talking, big boiler replacements, big roofing, if you have to all do parking lots and big dollar items, but they aren't increasing enrollment capacity or the square footage of the footprint of the building. And then these, as Beth again alluded to, they're eligible for 30% of the costs. And because they were type 2, there wasn't a ceiling that capped out what the state would contribute to these. There was no statutory limit to the dollars that could be spent on these. But you had to go through the preliminary application process. And then all the SBE rules that we'll talk about a little bit later on were all relevant to the project. And everything that with the project had to comply with all the stipulations within those SBE rules. Definitely needed the AOE to approve before the construction was started. Unlike the emergency construction, you don't have to wait for the approval. You have to fix your emergency, and then it's kind of discussing what money can you get in a reimbursement scheme. Not the case here. You have to definitely have the approval. And then same kind of cost release, half at approval, and then once commission and the full audit's done, then the balance is issued. The major one, which is all the schools that we're probably facing a lot of considerations for, are the type 1 construction, which is major additions, major renovations, or a new school. And so these have all the same requirements of the type 2 that we just discussed prior. But now this is where we get into the discussions about what are the eligible costs, the maximum costs for state participation. The capital outlay finance formula is the formula that the AOE would use to calculate what is the state's contribution going to be. And it was based upon minimum square footages for each program and service space area that were required. If a school elected to build more square footage for those program service space, they could, but obviously impacts overall costs, and eventually it caps. The state caps it based on a gross square footage by school type and grade level and enrollment. So the maximum cost for state participation is a dollar value the state derives from the design that is submitted for approval. And it's taking a look at square footage and enrollment, comes up with this MCSP number, and the award would be based upon that 30% of that MCSP. I went through a pre-approval recently for a school district. Theirs was like a $99 million construction project. The MCSP ended up being 82 million. So we would give 30% of the 82 million, and they now have to bond the balance, the difference, right? So it's a good thing to keep track of, that just because a bond is a certain dollar value, the state award, if we ever went back to a percentage ratio, it may not be even. They'll have to bond more than the state MCSP value at 30%.
But we would be paying, if we had the school construction project in place now and paying 30%, we'd be paying 30% of the 82 million.
That's right,
correct?
that's right,
Which is about 24 million
that's right.
for one school.
For one school, right.
And half, when they put in the shovel in the ground, when they start that construction, they would anticipate $12 million that fiscal year and from us somehow.
Mhm.
And then a couple, 3 years later, when they finished and everything was approved and signed off, they would anticipate the remaining
Right.
12 million. And if we don't have the money, they're picking up the interest costs
Hmm.
on those state dollars they're not getting.
Wow, yeah.
So we have to look, do we have the cash flow wherever the money's coming from on the state level if we do a school construction project, whatever that percentage is? Do we have enough cash flow every year to meet our obligation to our schools?
Hmm.
Those projects are not going to be small projects. They're all going to be big projects coming out.
That's where that prioritization became so important, was that when there wasn't adequate funding to fund all of the need at the time, we would start with a prioritization, but we did at the end, I didn't see a little more movement on that. But in the spirit of fairness, because if there was limited funds, I think there was a prorated. I think that's what you were referencing.
We did prorate it. Because we want all the districts to at least get some
To
money.
get something, because they were all incurring.
Yeah, because they were, some
That's
schools
right.
had been done and completed for 4 years, 3 years, and they hadn't even gotten their first
They
payment.
hadn't gotten
yet.
their first payment, correct? Yes.
That's.
Okay.
Yeah, once it was approved, it created that entitlement to the funds. However, it didn't tell you when you would get them.
Yeah, that's a worry.
It was.
For sure.
Very
I mean,
real,
the
very
real
real
world.
pain.
Yeah.
Yep.
Exactly.
Well, I think that feeds into some of the things we've talked about is for our work here is what is the expectation? What's the expectation of our school districts when they say, we're going out to construction, we want state money? And what's their expectation? Do they think they're going to have half of that project paid for by the state? And also, what's the expectation of our legislative colleagues? Because the reality is, I don't know if we can pick up a lot of those costs. I mean, you're looking at Burlington, their construction right now for their high school is 170 million.
Mhm.
How can a state afford to absorb all that cost? It could, could be our responsibility, could have been 40 million of that, who knows? That's what we're gonna have to grapple with. We have realistic expectations.
Yeah.
Right. There was also a bit of a reality that with these programs, there were additional requirements that districts were held to. And so that actually added to the expense a little bit. So by participating in the program, the cost of that project might have a little more expensive due to bonding requirements, insurance requirements, oversight requirements that were additional to what would be required today. All still really good practices that we would encourage and hope our districts were still participating in, but not required while it's on suspension.
Okay, and then we'll just move on. I mean, the suspended programs in terms of the consolidation, construction, aid, Beth touched on the 50% that would have been available for that. For the biomass, 90% originally, and then cut down to 75%. Performance contracts resulting in energy efficiency, 20% aid. And then, lucky for the CTEs, 100% funding, 92 BGS, right? So that's kind of a nice bucket to be in there. So when we start talking about priority, there was a pretty neat priority rating matrix that was implemented. It's based, when you pulled up the maximum points, it came out to 143 points, I think, because I had these numbers up. And then each of these criteria, community use, was part of the construction project, bringing into play a community benefit, and part of that educational space is being used for the community, and you would get 2 points for doing that. If consolidation was in the plan, you could get a maximum of 10 points. And then issues that would impact health and safety, 24 points. And you can go down and we won't go through every one of them in detail, But these are the types of things that were being looked at. The big one being enrollment projections, right? The maximum points being 40, that's a big part of it. So if the district's growing and you're undersized, obviously you want to try and prioritize on schools that are undersized and enrollment is growing. They need space somehow, so monies have to be invested in getting that space. And then for years in the process, if you had submitted an application and because of lack of funding or it didn't fall high enough on the priority list, you would get 5 additional points for every year that you were in the queue. So if you were in the queue for years, you would be racking up substantial points. But if everybody's building up points because there's not enough money, it's, I think, it's a wash. That's right.
Bob and Cassandra, can I ask a clarifying question? Am I correct that it was a 30% for not thinking about biomass or the other projects, but a 30%, and it was, there was no consideration for things like, community poverty levels or like the say, percent of FRL students in the district or school. Is that correct? It was just sort of that one base.
30%.
Okay, thanks.
But to that point, Joe, I'm looking back there because I hear your voice. To that point, there was something that considered unhoused students as a percentage of the enrollment. And then on this slide here, and I don't know the history of it or can't speak to it very well, but I did notice that it said that if the unhoused students is equal or greater than 40%, you get the full maximum points. So that kind of is a way where they're at least getting prioritized higher if you had some sort of poverty that was leading to unhoused students. So even though the award as a percentage didn't vary, it gave you a higher priority ranking.
Clarifying, Cassandra, by unhoused students here, we're not talking about sort of McKinney-Vento homeless and foster care. We're talking about students who don't have room in the school.
There's no room in the school.
Yeah, so it's not yeah, so unhoused is a little bit of a vague term there, but I think it just means that they're over their maximum. Yeah,
Oh, is
Yeah.
that? Okay, all right, okay. All
yeah,
right,
terminology there was tripping me up as well, Bob.
yeah, I looked up unhoused and I came up with what I thought to be a reference to not in their own domicile and being housed elsewhere. Okay. All right.
The slide that had the stack of scoring criteria. What's an identified school?
Oh, yeah, there you go. I put all the definitions of what they are on the subsequent pages. It's identified as a need of technical assistance. It almost ties into what Courtney was talking about with the DQS, but there's some other metric that's being used for student outcomes. And if it gets on that identified school list, then I'm presuming that there's some correlation between student outcomes and the safety and health of the building itself. So I imagine, I don't know, but I would.
Well,
imagine-
school quality standards is still in the rule that you probably looked this up on, but it's an older set of standards. It's no longer, right? They've been replaced by the education policy
Yeah.
standards.
But I think it's something that's a non-facility related measurement and it has something to do with some other criteria associated with the outcomes of the student. All right. When we get into the SBE rules, I've given you live links to those as well. But there's a bunch in the rules and the three main ones that are applicable to the construction of the 6000 series, the 6300 and the 6400 series. And the bulk of information is in the 6000 series. And this is where they actually go into pretty good detail, not pretty good, very good detail about all of the requirements that the state board is looking to see in any school construction project. And these are all the same things that we're admiring in, say, Rhode Island's model of school construction. So these are just sound construction ideas necessarily. No one has, the monopoly on sound reasoning when it came to construction. This program was solid. It was solid and it was requesting all the information that anyone who had to make a decision would want. And then putting in safety guidelines to make sure that the monies that would be spent by the state would really be being spent on projects that were sound. And so I think the intent of all these SBE rules was well-grounded. And so they're here for reference, but we won't go into every one of them. But but they all tie into things that you have to consider. Is my school proposed going to house all the students that our enrollment projections are going to be shown, right? So we require enrollment projections to make sure that we're not buying a two-door sedan when we really need a 15-passenger van, right? And so we're making sure that the school building is sized enough to handle the enrollment projections going out for 10 years. So it's these type of things that just make sense, right? And so all the SBE rules that you see here, just in the 6,000 series alone, are going through and looking at all that. Within the minimum space requirements that we talked about earlier with the capital outlay financing formula, that's something that we'll have to take another look at going forward. The ed specs taking a look at what's the minimum square footage. I know in the task force, there was always talk about what's a 21st century modern learning school. And there's different ideas about that. The reality is, though, as you mentioned earlier, is we may increase our square footages for all these program spaces, but if there's going to be a cost per square foot, right, it still causes a problem in funding it all, right? So even that, we have to be mindful, even if we update our ed specs and go to larger square footages, okay, it just makes the hole bigger that we have to fill from a money perspective. So it's wonderful to take a look at that. Even though our square footages are less than some of our neighboring states, they aren't by huge orders of magnitude. You know, like New Hampshire may have 185 square feet where we have 175. So we're not talking huge palatial differences in the square footages that adjacent states are using. And
Can I ask a clarifying question on the square footages? Is that square footage of the entire building, or is it just like, are there parts of the building that aren't included in the square footage? Or
well,
the entire?
there's recommendations and minimum requirements for the programming and school spaces, and then the service spaces that support that. So classrooms for kindergarten, maybe 250, up to a class size of 30 or whatever, right? And then for each student increment, you would add some nominal square footage on top. That takes care of the program service space area square footage, but then there's a gross square footage that caps the total building footprint. And that's tied to the MCSP.
Okay, so that's included in the MCSP, the gross.
Yeah, they're taking a look at gross square footage per student. So high school right now in the COP formula that is, I think it's 180 per student for high school. You multiply that by the number of enrolled students that it's being designed for, you get that gross square footage. We have a gross square footage unit cost that we apply it to that, and you come up with the MCSP. You have to also add in site prep work. They tell you how many acres they're doing for site development. Are they doing any kind of on-site sewage treatment? And then you have to factor those costs in based upon a flat rate per square foot of the site impacted. Yeah, you total all that up and that's what you get for the MCSP.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
The way it all worked together was actually, it allowed for a little bit of, a whole lot of customization, because each district may choose a little bit of a different model in what they wanted their school to look like or what they wanted their educational programming to look like. So while one was really focused on the individual spaces, like Bob is talking about, the other being the gross square footage, made them make choices so that they didn't overbuild or have no limits on it, which is often why we might see, for instance, a gymnasium and a cafeteria share a space in a small elementary school.
Made them
The
make
pressure
choices.
would have been felt at that,
Or gave them choices.
the total, right, exactly.
And I think one thing that was really helpful, the school boards were not out there on their own working with the architects. Because the architect could provide something and say, oh, you really need this. But then there was a check with the school district. The boards had someone within AOE that they could talk with directly and say, hey, wait a minute here, that's a
Not
little.
necessarily need that.
Right.
Between the staffing, the state board rules, the construction planning guide, the school construction planning guide, it really was a toolkit that helped school boards who, they do their best, but their task is large and it's very complicated and it requires a layer of expertise, right? That they don't necessarily have at the beginning of a school construction project. And so those were really helpful tools to help them even know where to start. What do ed specs need to look like? How do I know what I want my building project to, what do I want it to do? What do I want my classroom sizes to be? What programs are going to be important? And then that MCSP and the COF really did help them to calculate in what they report.
So I'm kind of thinking about that whole system that we had in place and how that would play into what we've heard this morning in two areas where we're looking possibly at a facilities management person or entity within each school district or supervisory district, union district, whatever the term is. And then I think what you just mentioned in terms of really working with that individual school board for a project that they're thinking in their school, and I'm thinking of what we talked about, Sheldon. You know, they maybe need an addition, but if they had the real expertise at the table with them through our current system that we had, where we had folks from AOE, folks in the parameters of the standards with the State Board of Education, really would help that little town say, yes, we really need this. That might help those other 3 or 4 towns that are in that district to understand the need in that community. Right now, they're on their own.
They're on their
They're
own.
on their own right now, but with the structure we had, they had some support.
I will say we're very fortunate in Vermont to have some really good architectural firms that have some pretty long-standing experience with building schools. But you're right, like that was just such a great opportunity. They would reach out, we would immediately connect them. We would let them know what ed specs, how do you go about, who should you involve in your ed spec creation? You know, let's get those principals and those building users involved. We would connect them immediately to our sister agencies that Bob mentioned at the top of the list for the partner sister agencies to make sure that they identified as early on in the process if they were going to run into any issues with things like permitting or A&R type of issues. It was so helpful.
Yeah.
I'm going through here and I just remember the joy of that work. It was really good work. It was a robust quality program that I do believe was a strong assistance to our districts who were undertaking this process.
So it wasn't the program that failed. It was the funding
Right, that's
that
what
failed.
I was gonna say, the framework seems
It was the
seems
funding.
good.
I guess my read on it a bit is yes, and because I think we're hopefully not recreating exactly as it was. And so to
Right.
me, what I see is the funding, absolutely put that in like, you know, in the parking lot /
Oh,
dream
yeah.
world. But even if you take that off,
Mhm.
the difference is it's still sort of aside from maybe like the biomass, like it was sort of hyper local priorities. It wasn't taking a state vision for this is how many buildings we should have, this is how many schools, this is what a building of the future looks like, this is what the educational needs are. It was really letting, okay, what do you think Williston is good for you? What do you think Springfield is good for you? And then plugging it into these categories, whereas in my mind, and I guess perhaps it's just what I'm trying to hear in the Rhode Island program is more of a here state of Vermont are the things that we're going for in the next 50 years. And if we're whatever we're going to invest, small or large, we need to be looking at newer and fewer. We need to be looking at something that gets us away from perhaps hyper local. If we're going to break up some of the pretzel, that there is perhaps a bit of a shift, and maybe I'm not sure I'm articulating that clearly, but there's some really good things there, and I think some governance pieces we might get into this afternoon. But there's also I think what we hopefully need to work towards is what is that state vision of what we're spending and where our buildings are, what they need to be able to do, how many people are in them, how many we're going to have in the future. That might be different from what the program was that existed, but that might just be my
No,
Yeah.
I agree.
editorial.
I agree. I think, we can't just cookie cutter this one and just say, let's start
Right.
this again, because we're in a whole different time and different education. So we do have to.
Yeah, no, don't let mine.
it's
That I'm influencing that way because I'm not at all, like, I actually agree with you if it were up, not that it is, but I agree that you wouldn't just lift the suspension. There's so much opportunity here. We're in a whole different place, even just looking at the costs, right? Like, we're talking back in the days of construction. I think the highest cost project, which was 3 schools that were all being renovated at the same time, was somewhere close to maybe 50 million, but that was 3 schools.
That was Brattleboro.
Brattleboro, yeah. So, we're in a really different space and education has changed. Educational needs have changed. And so, yeah, it's a really exciting thing to consider. But I also do agree that the agency did a good job
Yes,
at the
yes.
time
Yes.
with the program.
Absolutely. So how do we take kind of that and the world that we're in and come up with something that may have
Oh,
some
right.
similar outlines, but some
Yeah.
different,
Yeah, I think the framework for
Details.
construction
Yeah.
has to be built and be sound.
yeah.
How we feed projects into that is a whole nother issue. What is the strategic view for Vermont education? That's a separate initiative, but they all feed into this funnel called construction.
Yeah.
That's what we have to build robustly for today's world and today's,
But we have to be realistic on the funding.
Yep.
absolutely.
I come back to the
Absolutely.
funding because I've lived through two moratoriums on
Yes.
school construction. We had one in the early 2000s, late 1999, because we couldn't keep up with our obligation.
Hmm.
And that one lasted a couple of years. And then we had the big one that's still in effect. So I've been through two moratoriums because we have not had the funding capacity. And I keep harping on that because that will determine how successful we are. Because we had a great program, we had the bones, we had a great structure. That didn't fail. What failed was we couldn't keep up financially. That's
And
what
the costs now are just.
Yeah.
Right.
the cost now.
It's really hard to imagine, except they're very real.
Yeah. Gonna be more
Very,
difficult
very
now.
real. We've just experienced a lot of school construction with those federal ESSER fundings. And so we've been looking at projects a little more in the last few years, and the costs are as
Just
real
look
as
at
it gets,
Burlington
just
High
as real
School.
as it gets.
170 million. And if we're doing, and that was PCBs.
Parking lot, we are going to confront
Right.
that today.
Okay, I know, in the interest of time, you guys are late. The other two sets of standards would be then, 6,300 series, pre-qualification of bidders. And again, there was a lot of, really good work here, talking about how to pre-qualify bidder. And then, notification to the bidders once they were deemed to be pre-qualified. And then a 6,400 series for the construction manager. And this is a whole topic that could be a day for itself, right? What type of project management philosophy do you want to undertake as a school district? Some school districts have depth of bench in their facilities department, others do not. And there's no run right answer for any given situation. It's really what works for the individuals and the organization at the moment. So, but there's the construction manager as an advisor, there's construction management, a manager as a constructor, and then general contractor. And there's benefits to all of those, right? But if you can involve construction management oversight from the very project inception, they're actually helping inform the constructability of an architectural design. And I think there's value to that, personally. But and they're there right from the get-go. Whereas if you go through design, bid, build, you're looking at a general contractor who has no history with this project other than the day that he does his site walkthrough and has the drawings and then develops a bid. And he's not necessarily keyed into the needs of the owner. He's really keyed into profitability in building this building, right? So each one has merits, and that's for each individual school district to decide.
I would say construction management seems to be the trend at the
Mhm.
moment.
Yeah. Okay, I think that's it in terms of the rules, but we certainly can go into more should you have questions about, a variety of.
And as folks have been saying this morning, as we go forward here, we're going to have to keep in mind, when are we talking about the law, the statute, the part we get to write, and when are we talking about rulemaking?
Right.
Which some of you have the LCAR perspective that I think helps us maybe understand it in more nuance. But I realize if I sent my class to lunch 45 minutes late, they would be mutinying like a. So
We're grown up.
so we will pause and we will come back at 1:15. I'm adjusting our time after lunch, but I think all good stuff here in terms of getting our heads around what exists in Vermont, what some of these issues are. I think we're actually.
One last thing.
Oh, yeah, please.
Before we have-
Yeah.
Jill brought up the grant program for the
Yes.
facilities master planning.
Yeah.
I think that's so pivotally important.
Yeah.
Right? Because as we move forward, it's gonna help through the educational specification development at a union or
Yeah.
district level, supervisory level. It's really gonna help inform. We can't do all of the buildings, and it's gonna help inform strategically for each SUSD what makes the most sense, given the resources we have.
Yeah.
And I think that master plan grant, even if we just get that funded,
Yeah.
it would be so critically important to get the ball at least rolling on this whole endeavor.
Yeah, and those are, that's money, all money is difficult, but those are not on the scale of,
Right.
you know, a $200 million high school building. So that's at least a slightly more digestible.
But the reality is, we did a facilities assessment and it's telling us we're sick.
Yeah.
We can't now say we're not gonna issue medicine, right? And so we have to come up with a way of funding it. We just have to, yeah.